As in the past, we have a speaker and a discussant. And the speaker is Bob Keohane, who is at the Woodrow Wilson School and Professor of International Affairs. One of his recent book is called Power and Governance in a Partially Globalized World. He has a reputation for thinking about a world that could be, not only the world that is, with an emphasis on international coherence and going beyond the free-for-all that we have at the present time. And it's certainly appropriate to think about the climate problem in such a context. The discussant is Charles Beitz, who is in the Department of Politics and the editor of Philosophy and Public Affairs. In both cases, we are engaging in this series, as I deeply hope we would, some of the top faculty on campus for whom this is a passing interest. So the challenge to talk here raises their level of commitment and engagement without becoming the demand of a formal paper and a professional society meeting and so forth. It's just the kind of handhold upward that we want this series to be. So we have two important colleagues joining us today, and I'm just thrilled. Without further ado, Bob, this is your title slide, and your title is Evaluating Climate Change, Institutions, Justice or Legitimacy.
Thank you, Rob, very much for the introduction. This is actually more than a passing interest of mine. And I'm going to turn on this microphone before I'm told to do so. I'm going to make three arguments today, and I'm delighted to be here to do so. The first one is that it will be infeasible to create just institutions for the climate change problem. There's no international climate change institutions that are politically and economically feasible will meet reasonable standards of justice. Even a pragmatic a system of positive incentives to poor countries is entirely setting aside coercion is unlikely to be consistent with a very high standard of justice. Secondly, since it will be politically and economically infeasible for powerful states to behave justly, their next best alternative is to build institutions that are legitimate in two senses. They are normally legitimate and sociologically legitimate, and I'll explain the difference in a few minutes. And thirdly, these legitimate institutions need to extend beyond the climate change issue area to create what I call a regime complex that is institutionally legitimate. Those are my three basic arguments. And so let me first talk about the, there they are, as a matter of fact, I forgot I had a slide for them. Let me talk then about the infeasibility of really just institutions. Not being a political philosopher, I will simply adopt a conception of justice based on the work of John Rawls. For me, institutions are just if rational citizens, not knowing their own interests or taking into account comprehensive doctrines, Rawls's phrase, such as religious doctrines, would agree behind this veil of ignorance that a certain set of institutions made sense. This is a notion of justice as fairness. Without knowing whether the institutions would help us or not, we'd regard them as fair. We don't know if we're going to be rich or poor in China or the United States. We have to have a sense then of are these institutions just, not knowing our particular situation. So for example, in Rawls's system, economic inequalities that would function to help the worst off in the system would meet the standard of justice as fairness. Now, in real-world institutions, unfortunately, are not created behind the veil of ignorance, and they are not fair. The UN is not fair. 5 countries that were powerful or friends of the powerful, in China's case, after World War II, have a veto in the Security Council, and nobody else does. The World Trade Organization is not fair, the WTO. Its rules and practices have systematically advantaged rich countries. The IMF is not fair. Principles of austerity and submission to surveillance are regularly imposed on weak countries, but they're not imposed on rich, powerful countries such as the United States, the origin of we are, of course, the origin of the present financial crisis. There is no reason to believe, unfortunately, that climate change institutions will be different. There is increasing agreement among scientists that human-induced carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change, involving a warming of the atmosphere and increasing the probability of extreme climate-related events. In pre-industrial times, as many of you know, there were about 285 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now there are about 380 parts per million. Even if emissions did not continue to rise, if emissions don't rise, these concentrations would increase, since it's a long-lived gas. A recent paper in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences provides evidence that even if greenhouse gas concentrations were fixed at the 2005 levels, the world would experience warming in the range of 1.4 to 4.3 degrees Celsius, which is above the level that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has indicated would constitute serious anthropogenic disturbance with the atmosphere. At these levels, there are serious dangers of a widespread deglaciation of the Greenland ice sheet, more melting of Arctic ice seas, and major reductions in Himalayan river flows, on which Asia depends. So you have a danger, and Rob Sokolow has discussed it, if sea level rises as much as 8 meters, which would submerge many coastal areas of the world. Now this is, as Rob points out, not a matter, if we weren't already living in these areas of the world, on the coast, it wouldn't matter so much, but of course we've built up the coastal areas. So as he says, quote, we've gotten very locked into this particular way of using the planet. Now the implication of these scientific arguments is that to avoid extremely serious dangers of massive dislocation as a result of climate change, the world as a whole will have to drastically reduce its emissions of greenhouse gases, especially CO2. But emissions worldwide are still rising, as you probably know. If we compare the U.S. and China, which account for 40% of current emissions between them, approximately equal amounts, the United States accounts for, historically, for 29% of total emissions over the course of human history, and China for only 8%. But Chinese emissions have just passed those of the United States by most measurements. So because its population is so much larger than the United States, per capita emissions in China are only 1/4 to 1/5 as much as U.S. emissions. So if it's on a per capita basis, we're much worse than they are. But emissions are growing in both countries, and on a per capita basis, they're growing 4 to 6 times as fast in China. So we have a pattern here where the U.S. has been the principal, and the West in general, the principal historical contributor to climate change. But right now, the rapid rises are taking place in developing countries, and China leading among them. Now, what this means is that even if the United States and all other high-income countries were to completely eliminate their own greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, which will certainly not happen, emissions from developing countries on a business-as-usual scenario, if they don't do anything, would push CO2 concentrations above 450 parts per million between 2020 and 2030, and above 550 parts per million after 2030. So the reality is then that countries whose per capita emissions are much lower than ours and whose citizens are much poorer will be under great pressure to lower their emissions, thus delaying their move toward economic equality with the rich countries. So we face a stark tension between the abstract requirements of justice and the political and economic realities of the world. Justice could imply equal per capita emissions, as Peter Singer argued last fall in this series. Such allocations could take into account historical emissions, or they could ignore them. Another conception of justice put forward by Rob Sokolow is that, quote, individuals who emit similar amounts of carbon dioxide, regardless of where they live, are expected to contribute to carbon dioxide emissions reductions in similar ways, unquote. So a variety of schemes for just allocation is possible. Yet in any scheme that is plausibly just, I argue, the burdens would fall disproportionately on the rich and the powerful, because we emit so much more. Now we have emitted so much more in the past. Unfortunately, a general principle of politics is that the rich and powerful seek to push the burdens of adjustment onto others and shirk it themselves. That's the point of being powerful. So we can expect vigorous actions by powerful states to induce poorer countries to reduce emissions. And this is what J. Timmons Roberts and Bradley Parks call a climate of injustice. So we have this tension between the abstract requirements of justice and the political and economic realities of the world. Now, from a pragmatic point of view, wealthy countries that want to limit the magnitude of climate change will have to offer incentives to developing countries. Developing countries will not agree otherwise. China, India, and others will not agree to limit their greenhouse gas emissions unless they get substantial incentives to do so. And it might appear that such incentives will solve the justice problem, since they be voluntarily accepted by the poor countries. The ethical issues are not so simple, as I'll point out in a few minutes. Let's think first about the pragmatic issues. Climate change policy produces a public good. The good, an atmosphere with a lower concentration of greenhouse gases than otherwise would be the case, is public because nobody can be prevented from consuming it, and because consumption by one person does not affect anybody else's consumption. The key point is that non-contributors cannot be prevented from benefiting from others' mitigation actions. Since the public good is costly to supply because mitigation efforts are expensive, and non-suppliers cannot be excluded from enjoying it, there is little incentive independently for states to supply it. It's not going to happen independently and voluntarily. It isn't like a private good in which you perhaps want to buy it for yourself. The only exception to this bleak rule is a country that is so large and in which the benefits of action are so important that it would gain by acting even if others are free riders. That is, if they benefit without paying from its actions. Otherwise, the public good will not be supplied or will be supplied at a suboptimal level. The public goods literature has another unfortunate implication. Reductions in emissions by the United States might even have a perverse effect on other states' incentives. That is, the free rider logic suggests that effective actions on climate change by the United States and other industrialized countries could reduce the incentive for other states acting independently to limit their emissions and take similar actions to slow down climate change. Hence, the rich countries, for their own policies to be effective, will have to devise measures that are designed to induce other countries to reduce emissions. There's no, the Kyoto pathway of only limiting the rich countries is a dead end. If there is to be effective action, it's going to have to limit the emissions of developing countries where the increases are taking place and where the low cost, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, possibilities for reducing emissions are most abundant. So these incentives then have to be both tangible and intangible. And intangible payments include transfer payments of some type from rich to poor countries. Intangible incentives include setting an example by implementing drastic reductions in our own greenhouse gas emissions and being willing to submit ourselves to a global regime that limits our actions and monitors our responses. Now, from a pragmatic standpoint, the issues that incentives raise are strategic. How can these incentives be used to induce positive action by others? Others have an incentive, by the way, to overstate how much they require in order to agree, that is, not to reveal their true preferences, and to bargain tough. And how can these incentives be made politically acceptable to publics in rich countries who will pay for them? I don't envy the politicians who explain why it's important for us to transfer tens of billions of dollars in one form or another to China. These are hard problems, and they have not been solved. From an ethical standpoint, acting through incentives can be compared with coercion and with persuasion. The coercion involves the use of power, but so in different ways does the use of incentives when the rich use their superior resources to buy off the poor. A persuasion is the least problematic way to get others to do what we desire. But the public goods nature of the climate change problem and the various justice-related rationales that could be used by poor countries to resist acting, they have a whole list of rationales they can use of why they shouldn't have to act because of issues of justice, make persuasion alone unlikely to succeed. Coercion seems to me undesirable and also self-defeating. It's very hard to imagine how coercion could actually operate in this area. So we're back with incentives. The only way this is going to be solved was some set of incentives then, which the rich countries offer to the poor countries and induce them, therefore, voluntarily or semi-voluntarily to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. What are the ethical issues involved then in deploying massive incentives to induce action by poor countries on climate change? Ruth Grant argues that we can evaluate the use of incentives according to three primary criteria. Are they used to achieve a legitimate purpose? Are they voluntary? Do they not? What is their effect on the character of the parties involved? Since we're dealing with incentives for states, in this case, I'm going to set aside the character issue. It's hard to think of the character of states. They'd only be bad characters anyway. Or to trace how different incentives to states would affect the character of their citizens. But the fact that we're dealing with states means we have to substitute something different. And I'm going to substitute the notion that this pattern of behavior at the international level not worsen distributions among individuals. That it's going back to Rawls. If we were applying the standard of justice, we'd have to have a system which did not worsen the distribution of resources among individuals. That it didn't make the worst off, for example, in opposite of Rawls's criteria. So with respect to incentives to poor countries to reduce emissions, voluntariness depends in good measure on whether the incentives are punitive or positive. Punitive incentives involving blackmail or the equivalent are really coercive and highly problematic ethically. Positive incentives, giving money, can be assumed to be voluntary unless the recipient is in desperate condition and other aid which would ethically be offered to it otherwise is withheld for the purpose of enhancing the incentives involved. Legitimate purpose seems clear in our climate change case. So except then for concern about internal distribution, incentives to poor countries to reduce greenhouse gases, gas emissions, seem ethically justified to me. That is, there's no in principle bar to saying that it's all right for the rich countries to provide these incentives to poor countries and induce them to reduce climate emissions. So for example, suppose there's a global cap and trade system as in the Kyoto Protocol, but one that covers rich and poor countries. A rich country could transfer $50 billion, say, to a poor country to achieve emissions reductions that would cost $100 billion in the rich country, but only $30 billion in the poor one. Everybody gains from that trade. The problem from the standpoint of our Rawlsian criterion is that it will typically not be feasible for the rich country to determine who in the poor country gains from this $50 billion. It is likely that rich people and governing elites in the poor country will benefit disproportionately from the transfer. Urban people may benefit, rural people may lose. The worst off people may in fact lose relatively or even absolutely. So in a variety of plausible conditions, even an otherwise praiseworthy arrangement for incentives would not meet the Rawlsian criteria of justice. We can lament injustice and we can try to reduce it, but it will not be eliminated. So we have to reach a pessimistic conclusion. Reducing the magnitude of climate change sufficiently to avoid massive disruptions is unlikely to be consistent with the high standards, at least, of global justice. So I turn to legitimacy, because I'm worried that if we simply talk about justice and worry about justice and apply a high standard, we're going to run into a stone wall. We're going to decide that the arrangements that are in fact made are unjust, and we will maybe tempted to oppose them. But in fact, those standards are unrealistic. We're never going to achieve them in world politics, and so we'd be letting the best become the enemy of the good. We'd be opposing something that was the best we could do because it didn't meet our standards of justice. So I want to talk about legitimacy and not about justice. Now, and I want to emphasize what I take, at least, as a crucial distinction between legitimacy and justice. All human institutions are flawed. Multilateral institutions are deeply marked by inequalities of power, and interest based struggles by states. And hence, it's almost inconceivable, to me at least, that they would meet standards of justice, which is an ideal standard. But neither do the politically realistic alternatives, unilateral action, or ad hoc coalitions designed to achieve the actor's purposes, meet the ideal standards of justice. Legitimacy, though, is a threshold value. It's a threshold value in a non-ideal world. And it seems to me it's a more practical and achievable goal than the goal of justice. It involves some outcome elements, as I'll discuss, and it also involves procedural elements, such as transparency and accountability, that are somewhat different from the value of justice. So since progress toward justice, or toward greater justice, requires effective institutions, it'd be self-defeating to withhold the support from institutions because they fail to meet the demands of justice. Our standards of legitimacy, therefore, I think, should be less demanding than our standards of justice. But they should maintain opportunities for progressive improvement, working toward a situation which may not be just, but is closer to a just situation than it was before. So in my view, debates about institutional legitimacy are more relevant for policy than debates about justice. Now, legitimacy has both a normative and a sociological meaning. To say an institution is legitimate in the normative sense is to assert that it has the right to rule, where ruling is promulgating rules and attempting to secure compliance with them by attaching costs to noncompliance. Ruling doesn't require that the rules be backed by coercion, and it does not presuppose the state. Now, that's normative legitimacy. To say an institution is legitimate in the sociological sense is to assert that it's widely believed to have the right to rule. So if we take a normative point of view, we can make a judgment as to what makes institutions legitimate from our point of view. If we ask sociologically, we ask, well, what do you think? What do all of you think makes institutions legitimate? So if I think a certain institution is illegitimate, it doesn't meet my standards, then it's not, in my view, normatively legitimate. But if I take a poll and most of you say it is legitimate, then it's sociologically legitimate in this room, at any rate. So even pure pragmatists who don't care about ethics have to worry about sociological legitimacy. If climate change institutions favored by governments of rich countries are not regarded as having the right to rule by leaders of developing countries and publics of democracies anywhere, they won't be effective. Normative and sociological legitimacy are closely linked, although they're distinct analytically, and I'm interested in both. So let me talk about 5 principles of legitimacy, of normative legitimacy, which I would hold to. I said I wasn't a political philosopher. I'm not, but I'm going to take an ethical stand here and say that there are 5 principles that will help define whether an institution is legitimate. I'm not talking about policy about individual leaders or about a given policy. I'm talking about whether an institution, such as a climate change institution that we might want to set up, would be legitimate. The first principle is minimal moral acceptability. That is, governance institutions shouldn't commit serious injustices, and if they do, they shouldn't persist in doing so. And they should not violate basic human rights. If they do, we shouldn't take their rules as binding. That is, we shouldn't regard them as legitimate. And institutions that rely on coercion are in more danger of violating this criterion than those that do not. So this principle of moral acceptability is closely linked to Ruth Grant's principle of voluntariness. The second principle is inclusiveness. To have a claim to make rules on a global basis, institutions have to be open to all peoples who are willing to participate in attaining the goals sought by the institution. Inclusiveness is a fundamental democratic principle. The constraints of world politics, of course, mean that inclusiveness in world politics does not mean equality of voice. That would be unrealistic. But people should not be arbitrarily excluded from participation in discussions about global governance. We don't expect Malawi or even South Korea to have as much weight as the United States and China in these discussions, but they should not be excluded. Their voice should be heard, even if they don't have a strong influence. My third criterion of legitimacy is epistemic quality, a little bit less familiar. Epistemic quality has 2 dimensions: institutional integrity and transparency. Institutional integrity refers to the relationship between an institution's performance and the truth. Institutions lack integrity in the first instance if they're based on beliefs that are palpably false. Institutions based on racism, for example, are ipso facto illegitimate, whatever their other qualities, because beliefs about racial superiority are demonstrably incorrect. Institutions that systematically distort information so it's the opposite of the truth, for example, Stalinist Russia, are also ipso facto illegitimate, no matter what else they might accomplish. Institutions also lack integrity if they exhibit patterns of egregious disparity between their actual performance and their self-proclaimed activities. They say that they're doing one thing, they're doing something that's very, very different. So an institution then is presumptively illegitimate if its practices or procedures predictably thwart the credible pursuit of the very goals in terms of which it justifies its existence. Epistemic quality also requires a degree of transparency. That is, the institution's actions have to be understood by outsiders. Information about how the institution operates must be accessible at reasonable cost. My claim is that not that outcomes are necessarily better with transparent institutions. They may or may not be. There may be trade-offs between transparency and effectiveness. But my argument is that the dispersal of information among a plurality of people and groups outside the institution provides some counterbalance to the informational asymmetries that normally benefit insiders. There should be a presumption of transparency, a rebuttable presumption. Maybe it can be overturned in some cases, because organizations are likely to use secrecy to pursue their own interests, distinct from those of the public, because in the long run, if transparency has bad effects, it can be identified and reduced. But if there can be no democratic processes, response to secret government action. My fourth standard is accountability, which is crucial to democratic theory because it provides for the rule to have power over rulers. Accountability involves three elements: standards that those who are held accountable are supposed to meet; information available to accountability holders who can then apply the standards, for example, the public and the electorate in a democratic country; and thirdly, the ability of these accountability holders to impose standards, to impose sanctions, to attach cost to failure to meet the standards. Now, almost all institutions are accountable to somebody, only to the criminal gang or the godfather behind the scenes. In The Godfather, Brando's agents are accountable, but only to him. So accountability as such is not sufficient. It must be the right sort of accountability. Democratic accountability is about distributing power downward to the rules from the rulers in a way that helps institutions meet other standards. So accountability is a power term. It relates to a distribution of power as well as to giving an account. I've saved the fifth principle for last. Multilateral institutions must pass the test of comparative benefit. This principle incorporates Grant's notion of legitimate purpose, but it goes further. Institutions must produce results that are better than those of alternative feasible institutional arrangements and better than having no institutional arrangement. Now, the benefits can be substantive, such as security, welfare, or ecological quality. They can be procedural, such as the ability to work with people from diverse societies to solve problems cooperatively rather than coercively, and to create opportunities to learn new ways of thought. Either way, to be legitimate, institutions must be effective. So how do we apply these principles to climate change? I'm going to ask 6 questions that are closely related to these five principles about any institution. First, do they have legitimate purposes and promise to achieve beneficial results? Second, are they voluntary and otherwise morally acceptable? This combines Grant's voluntariness with my moral acceptability. Are they inclusive? Is their epistemic quality high? Are they accountable? Do they predictably avoid assisting violations of justice as fairness? Now, a cap-and-trade architecture for a climate change regime would set country limits for emissions and allow countries to issue permits, emissions permits up to these caps. Unused permits could be traded on markets and acquired by countries whose emissions exceeded their caps or by business firms in those countries. Such a cap-and-trade regime scores quite well on our 6 principles. It seeks to achieve a legitimate purpose and is an efficient way to do so. It would be voluntary and implies no violations of human rights. It would be inclusive. All states would be entitled to join on comparable terms. It would have to be consistent with scientific knowledge, transparent and accountable if it were to function effectively. Only on the last issue does it encounter problems, as I mentioned above. Huge flows of funds to elites in poor countries could distort priorities and outcomes there. So on this sixth principle, we're going to have to hold it and sort of think about how to design institutions that might improve or complement the climate change architecture. But the realities of North-South conflicts of interest on climate change mean that the legitimacy of any climate change regime will be challenged. To enhance the legitimacy of the whole enterprise sociologically, it seems desirable to create what I call a regime complex of interlocking institutions that are collectively more legitimate than standalone climate change institutions could ever be. So my claim is that even if we set up a fairly decent climate change set of institutions, they're not going to meet the standards of justice, given power politics. They could be legitimate in themselves, but they're probably not going to have enough legitimacy to carry the weight that they need to hold. So in this third and final section of this lecture, I'm going to put forward five complementary institutions, proposals for 5 institutions that could bolster the legitimacy of the regime as a whole. The first proposal is there should be a system of global administrative law to ensure that the organizations managing the regime follow due process. In the United States, administrative law assures that you have some recourse, there's some accountability if a bureaucracy takes action without due process of law, which affects you adversely. You can appeal that to courts. And the bureaucracy has to follow a relatively transparent and open process in the United States, for example, of notice and comment. You have to be informed about the rules. You have a chance to object to the rules. When the rules are applied to you, you can appeal. That's administrative law. There's not much of it at the global level. And for a climate change regime to be fully legitimate, it'll have to have some sort of system of administrative law attached to it. Some sort of court or appeals tribunal to which aggrieved states and qualified non-state actors could appeal. And this court would develop a case law enhancing both fairness and legitimacy. Otherwise, you wind up with a kind of arbitrary regime where you set up a global bureaucracy, not accountable to anybody, which could then allocate huge amounts of resources in ways that might be thoroughly unacceptable ethically. Second proposal is there should be, as part of the climate change regime complex, a sustained effort to strengthen administrative quality in developing countries. Developing countries often cannot monitor and implement their own policies. So there's danger that funds transferred through a cap-and trade regime would be wasted or even stolen. Indeed, a recent report on China and climate change says that a lack of training and poor incentives make it hard even for Beijing to understand what is happening on the ground or to enforce its own laws. Administrative incompetence erodes comparative benefit, and malfeasance leading to corruption would lead to increasing unfairness within countries, violating my Rawlsian principle. So for both pragmatic and ethical reasons, sustained efforts should be made through technical assistance to improve the quality of administrative systems in countries that we are seeking to induce to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Third proposal is, this is the one the United States will have the hardest time accepting, although it seems the simplest. Rich countries should formally accept surveillance and review of their own policies on other issues, such as financial regulation. The common practice of rich countries, especially in the United States, is to demand that others follow rules that we make, but not to follow comparable rules ourselves. And this is very evident right now in financial issues. This practice is what Krasner calls a form of organized hypocrisy that is ethically unjustifiable and that degrades the legitimacy of institutions that we try to use to influence others. So the new administration should move, as part of this regime complex, to adopt a policy that whatever rules in whatever domains we seek to impose on others should be imposed also on the United States. And in particular, that their surveillance and monitoring practices that are applied to others, so notably by the IMF on financial issues, should be applied also to us. It would help us out. If we had a little less rope, we couldn't have hung ourselves quite as badly. Fourth proposal is for an Institute for Justice and Innovation. Climate change is a public good, but many issues in world political economy involve private goods that are unfairly distributed, such as life-saving drugs. Monopoly pricing keeps them unavailable to many poor people. This is especially severe for poor people in poor countries where the government can't help out. Alan Buchanan and I are working on a proposal for what we call tentatively an Institute for Justice and Innovation that would have the right to acquire patents for drugs that are not diffusing rapidly enough to poor people around the world. Could expropriate, I wouldn't use that word, expropriate the patents for compensation. Such an institute is ethically justified in its own terms because it would facilitate the transfer of drugs to people who need them. We think it's institutionally more feasible than schemes that depend on the credibility of promises by international institutions to pay patent holders on the basis of the contribution of the drugs to relieving the global disease burden, as Thomas Pogge has suggested. Such an institute could also take action to ensure that new climate change technologies would be available worldwide without excessive payments. And in so doing, it would have to have the resources available, perhaps through a tax on the flows in the cap-and-trade regime, to compensate patent holders for worthwhile inventions. In addition to its other merits, the institute would be a costly signal by rich countries of their commitment, not just in climate change, where we're making the demands, for a more legitimate complex of multilateral institutions. My final proposal is that members of the climate change regime should build an economy of esteem around climate change. Let me explain that. Jeffrey Brennan and Philip Pettit of this institution have developed the concept of an economy of esteem. In the economy of esteem, incentives are provided not by material awards and deprivations or awards and punishment administered by the state, but by the attitudes that other people form in response to the actions of protagonists. People seek honor and respect, and this reality can be taken into account, they say, in designing institutions. Brennan and Pettit defend the proposition that esteem can provide a compelling set of motivations for actions, independent of material incentives or coercion, perhaps as complements to those. For esteem-based appeals to work, people need not be altruistic, but standards of good performance have to be clear, and it needs to be generally understood that others also understand and support the standards. One essential mechanism for creating an economy of esteem for climate change would be the institution of a number of prominent awards and prizes. The British and French governments in the 18th century established such prizes for technological innovations with some success, and some contemporary examples of major prizes for technology innovation also exist. My focus, though, is on prizes for politicians, especially former leaders of government. Prizes could be given to former leaders of governments who advanced efforts to mitigate climate change while in office. In this way, their incentives to act in a pro-green way would be enhanced. Such an economy of esteem for climate change could be created in a decentralized way. It would not require a coordinated agreement by states, would not even have to rely on government action. Foundations and wealthy individuals, if there are any left after last year, could establish the necessary prizes on the model of the Nobel Prizes. Foundations or other nonprofits could establish rating systems for evaluating the action or inaction of political leaders while in office. Since there's no need to wait for government action or international agreement, the institution of such prizes could begin immediately. I recognize that from the standpoint of ideal democratic theory, such prizes could make elected leaders less accountable to publics and could therefore be viewed with suspicion. But much of democratic leadership involves educating publics about important issues that may not be obvious to them and inspiring them to make collective efforts that they would not otherwise make. If prizes increase the incentives for democratic leaders to emphasize climate change in their policies and speeches, increasing public awareness of and support for effective institutions, this would, in my view, be a good thing. A system of prizes would also help to further legitimize the regime complex for climate change. So let me finish up and then let Chuck Beitz make his commentary. Justice is an ideal standard that will not be met in world politics. But legitimacy, as I'm using it at least, is a threshold value in a non-ideal world, indicating which institutions are sufficiently good to have a right to rule. If we build legitimate institutions, we've set ourselves a feasible task, and we also will be taking steps in the direction of the ideal of justice. So we'll be serving justice without demanding it as a standard. A cap-and-trade regime for climate change could be legitimate with the right provisions and well-conceived supplemental institutions. Its legitimacy would be enhanced by being embedded in a regime complex for climate change with 5 new institutions. These institutions would be designed with 5 purposes in mind: to ensure due process at the global level, to improve fairness at the domestic administrative level, to bolster legitimacy by making global surveillance more reciprocal, to facilitate the spread of useful technologies, and to encourage positive action on climate change through what Pettit and Brennan call an economy of esteem. Legitimate institutions such as these would meet reasonable ethical standards applicable to measures to reduce the magnitude of global climate change. And I think that we would do well if we thought about how to construct at least some of these institutions in the real world. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to Chuck's comments. With the microphone, Chuck, or do you?
Do I need to use this? Yes.
If you want to move around, you do.
It's on.
Thanks. Great. Thanks. Well, thank you, Rob, for the chance to comment on Bob's paper. It's a provocative and interesting one with those who know Bob's work with his characteristic blend of sophisticated normative political theory as well as both hard-headedness and imaginativeness about institutional design. As far as I can tell, there's only one clearly false sentence in the paper. It's the one in which Bob claims not to be a political philosopher, a claim that I think the paper itself sufficiently refutes. The comments I want to offer have to do with more with the political theory in the paper than with the institutional proposals at the end, though I think those proposals are terrifically interesting, and this idea of a regime complex that would surround climate change institutions, and I hope we can talk some about them in the question period. So Bob presents justice and legitimacy as differing in roughly the following way. Justice is an ideal value, the most we can hope for, morally speaking, whereas legitimacy is a threshold value, I think the least that we should accept. He says that legitimacy is less demanding than justice, but it doesn't conflict with it. Legitimacy is, so to speak, a way station on the path towards justice. So we can strive for legitimacy as we build new institutions and worry about justice later, because achieving legitimacy would be a step in the right direction. So I want to raise some questions, sort of one large one and three subsidiary ones, about a paper with which, on the whole, I find myself in agreement. So this is an attempt really just to give Bob a chance to say some more things to flesh out the position taken in what's really a very compressed presentation in the paper. Just to anticipate the large question, it goes something like this. Accepting that legitimacy is a threshold, whereas justice is an ideal, how do we know where to put the threshold? How do we know whether we have it high enough? Is it really just a matter of figuring out what's feasible and then going for the best feasible arrangement? Or is there some more moral content than that behind Bob's notion of legitimacy? So to frame the question, I want to start with a distinction that's implicit in the paper that kind of goes as follows. I think almost any mature understanding of either social or global justice will have both process-oriented and outcome-oriented elements, related in some more or less complicated way. Now, I say almost any mature view because not every view is like that. It isn't true of utilitarianism, for example, which at base is entirely outcome-oriented. But it's true of most other views about justice, including Rawls's view, which Bob refers to. And as he observes, Rawls wants institutions to be designed so that they produce distributions that satisfy his difference principle. That's an outcome standard. But he also wants institutions to respect everybody's equal liberties, including their equal political liberties. That's a process standard. Now, actually, I think it's more complicated than this in Rawls, although, I mean, it's always safe to say something like that where Rawls is concerned. But I'm going to pass by the complications for now. In a similar way, Bob's 5 conditions of legitimacy also include both outcome and process elements. So he thinks legitimate institutions should avoid producing certain kinds of bad outcomes. For example, they shouldn't endanger basic human rights, and they shouldn't increase distributive inequality. And they should also satisfy some procedural requirements. For example, they should have high epistemic quality, and they should be accountable. When Bob says that legitimacy is less demanding than justice, I think what he means is that legitimacy would require less substantial change from the baseline of the status quo on both outcome and process dimensions than would justice. beyond saying that we shouldn't endanger human rights or aggravate domestic-level inequality, Bob doesn't actually tell us very much more about what he thinks global justice is. But I think on any plausible view, it seems pretty clear that his conception of global institutional legitimacy demands less. The main question that I'd want to focus on is whether it demands enough, morally speaking, and if so, how we would know that that was the case. So I'm not very worried about the process side, and in fact, I think the question here is really whether the procedural innovations that Bob recommends would satisfy his own test of political realism. Some of these procedural recommendations are actually indicate a fairly substantial change from the status quo, and as he himself suggested, hard to reconcile with some of the things we think we know about power politics. I doubt that anybody looking at the IMF or the WTO or TRIPS would think that they satisfy the process aspects of Bob's conception of institutional legitimacy, despite years of protest from actors who want to see greater transparency and accountability. So why, then, would one think that a climate change regime would fare very much better? On the process side, the view seems to me very optimistic. That's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But the optimism needs somehow to be squared with Bob's own realism about what's practically achievable. But all that's a digression, because I think the place where the view might seem insufficiently demanding is on the outcome side. The most important issue for any cap-and-trade regime, after all, is where the caps should be set, or how and where the caps should be set, because that establishes the initial distribution of entitlements at which trading begins. With a few caveats involving the way it's administered, a trading system can be efficient wherever the initial caps are set. But that tells us nothing about the acceptability of the distribution, either before or after trading takes place. We need more than a criterion of legitimacy, of efficiency, to tell us where to set the entitlements. But the conception of legitimacy that Bob wants to apply to a climate change regime imposes only very minimal constraints that would influence where the caps ought to be set. It requires that a regime not violate basic human rights, and it shouldn't make the distribution of income worse than it was before. But beyond that, this conception of legitimacy doesn't speak explicitly to the impact of a climate change regime on the global distribution of well-being. This conception of legitimacy, as I understand it, seems to leave the allocation of entitlements mostly to power politics, even though prima facie there's no reason to believe that the outcome of self-interested bargaining will produce a normatively acceptable outcome. There are all kinds of moral arguments, some of which Bob alluded to, not only of justice but also of beneficence, why a climate change regime should favor the global poor, none of which seems to be taken account of in this view about legitimacy. So that's the large question. It's why wouldn't the poor countries be warranted in asking for more from a climate change regime than that it not make things worse in terms of human rights or exacerbate existing income inequality? So that's sort of the large question that I wanted to pose. And to put it more generally and in Bob's terms, what considerations should inform our thinking about where to set this threshold value of legitimacy to the extent that it imposes constraints on the outcomes that we ought to be willing to accept? This may be just a request to sort of hear more, but since it bears on the central issue about the construction of a cap-and-trade system, it would be good to hear more. So sort of thinking about this question, I can imagine three different ways that Bob might reply. I'm sure I've failed to imagine the fourth, which is the reply he'll give, but here are the three that I can imagine, each of which leads to a kind of further question that it would be interesting to hear more about. One thing he might say is that the supplemental steps that are mentioned at the end of the paper, this complex of other institutions that he suggests, one thing he might say is that those steps address the question of global distributive justice, at least to some extent. For example, in the sort of interesting proposal for the tweaking of the patent regime. My question about this would be where within this idea of normative legitimacy that's been proposed as the sort of basic moral principle, the demand for these substantive steps comes from. Is it, for example, a consequence of the basic human rights requirement? Or does it reflect the intrusion of some other value like global distributive justice? Or is it not really an ethical demand at all? Is it just something that we think is required in order to attain the sociological legitimacy of a climate regime? So that's a question about one potential reply. Another thing Bob might say is that it's just unrealistic to think that normative ideas about global justice or fairness, outcome-oriented ideas, will have any influence on the formation of a climate regime. I mean, he reminds us that rich countries are often not influenced very much by these arguments when allowing themselves to be influenced by the arguments would have big costs. I mean, it might really just be a case of power politics where the caps should be set, although it would be sophisticated power politics, as Bob notes, because any effective climate change regime will have to rest on a bargain that solves the collective action problem. And that will result in some payoffs to the poor countries. But then the question is why we should expect, if it's unrealistic to think that normative ideas about justice should influence outcomes, then the question is why we should expect things to be very much different with legitimacy. I mean, if it's unrealistic to expect the system of caps to satisfy any outcome standards of justice, why isn't it also unrealistic to expect a climate change regime to satisfy process standards for epistemic quality and accountability? I mean, those will also be costly to the rich countries. And why is it realistic to expect the rich countries in particular to accept some of the supplemental institutions that Bob thinks are necessary for legitimacy, when doing so would plainly conflict with the advancement of the rich country's own interests? So I guess I could say the second subsidiary question is, how do we know what the boundaries are of a plausible realism? And this leads to a third and the last possible reply to my question. Bob could say, a climate change regime won't work if it's not legitimate. People have to be willing to comply, and they won't if they don't regard the regime as having the right to rule. On the other hand, it doesn't seem that institutions have to be fully just to elicit compliance. People comply with unjust institutions all the time. Well, I think that might be true, but it raises yet another question. Bob distinguishes sociological from normative legitimacy, I think correctly. It seems to me the kind of legitimacy that's at stake in the "it won't work otherwise" claim is sociological, not normative. A climate regime won't work unless people, in fact, generally regard it as having a right to do whatever it is that it does. But Bob's 5 conditions are conditions of normative legitimacy. And it's an empirical question whether they're either necessary or sufficient for sociological legitimacy. So the question here is, why should we think that either is true, that is, that they're necessary or sufficient for sociological legitimacy? And in particular, why should we think that a climate change regime that's legitimate in Bob's sense, but doesn't embrace any more ambitious global distributive goal than the minimal one of not endangering human rights and not aggravating income inequality, would satisfy the poor countries enough to win the kind of acceptance that sociological legitimacy requires? Why shouldn't they just regard the regime as an imposition? So one large question and 3 small ones. The large question, again, is how we know where to put the legitimacy threshold, and is it enough to leave the caps to power politics, or does legitimacy set some boundaries to what we should regard as acceptable? And the smaller questions are, first, where in this idea of legitimacy do we find any grounds for a demand for steps like the changes in the patent system that Bob recommends, desirable in its own terms, that seem motivated by a concern for global rather than domestic justice? Second, why, if justice is unrealistic, should we think it's more realistic to achieve steps like transparency and accountability in a climate regime when it's been so difficult to achieve them in other existing global regimes? And in particular, why should we think it's realistic to expect the US and the UK to accept some form of international surveillance of things like financial regulation? And finally, why is it reasonable to expect the poor countries to voluntarily accept a cap-and-trade system in which the distribution of caps is left as a bargaining outcome? Why wouldn't a genuinely normatively legitimate system offer them some more substantial protection against the exploitation of bargaining with partners who are so much powerful than they are? So I'll stop there and give Bob a chance to speak. I give this back to you.
We're going to go to 6 o'clock, and it will be an exciting half hour. So
Thanks, Chuck, for a great set of comments. I'm going to focus on your major question. I could offer answers to the little ones, but the major question, so we have some time for discussion. That is, as you said, legitimacy, in my view, requires less change from the status quo than justice. Does it demand enough? And you're really saying, how would we know that it's enough? And I think you're right that there's an implicit argument here which wasn't made explicit, which is that there's an element of global distributive justice here. Somehow the argument is that we can attain justice, but legitimacy is a threshold value which is not all the way to justice, and we can make things more just if we have legitimate institutions. And that requires then that we have some notion of what would be a sufficiently just distribution, even if it's not purely just. And so I think we have to talk about the distribution of the gains that takes place. So how much, you're saying, if the poor countries only got a tiny bit over what they get otherwise, is that legitimate? It meets my criteria, it's better than the feasible alternatives, but it's not very good, and they can quite reasonably reject it. What this reminds me of, actually, is the ultimatum game in economics and increasingly sociology, anthropology, because there's a generalization that comes out of it, and I'm not sure I want to hold to this, but I'm going to just put it out as in the ultimatum game, there are two players, and there's a certain sum of money, and the player in the advantaged position, or the first mover at least, divides the money between the players. I tell Chuck, here's $1,000, all right? I tell Chuck, you can have $1 and I'll take the rest. The economist's prediction was Chuck would say yes. $1 is better than 0, right? And so why not? But Chuck doesn't say yes. Almost nobody says yes to that. There's variation cross-culturally, but on average in cross-cultural studies and in the U.S. among undergraduates, the most studied population, the minimum amount is about 25 or 30%. I should have said, if Chuck says no, neither of us gets anything, right? If I offer a division, if you accept it, that's what you get. If you reject it, we get 0, either of us. So you can punish me for making an unfair distribution, but you can't propose an alternative one. That's why it's the ultimatum game. And in fact, the average, in general, in these populations, people will not accept less than about 25 or 30%. There seems to be a general view of fairness that since I'm in an advantaged position, after all, I'm the one assigned by the investigator to have the choice of allocating the money. You don't accept half. You don't require half, but you require more or less half of half on average. And it seems to me one might ask whether a legitimate institution should follow roughly a comparable principle. That is, if you looked at the distance between the status quo over here and what we agree is a just distribution over here, and we agree that we aren't going to require justice as a standard, maybe we should say, well, if it gets to roughly a quarter of the way there, then it's legitimate. If it just gives a derisory amount to the poor, disadvantaged party, it's not. I'll stop there. I could respond to others, but that was none of your 3 answers to your... yes, sir, in the back.
I have a mic.
Scenario I see here.
Here comes the mic.
Wait for the mic and identify yourself.
Alan Finn's class of 74. I used to do architecture junior studio in this room many years ago, before it was a lecture hall. The scenario that I see coming through in this discussion is sort of like a room full of potential contingent beneficiaries on a trust for an infant who are all also named trustees. And they're all arguing over the proper disposition of assets that they will gain on an unfair allocation of rights to the infant, but they're all technically in a position to judge what the infant is going to be getting. The future didn't come up in this discussion at all, the stakeholders. Any inclusiveness scenario, any discussion of winners or losers is not between the rich and the poor countries or the people who are now living. It's between all of the living as a group and all future generations as a group who have no accountability, no power, no voice unless we give them one. And the problem that I see is that this whole process is assuming as a given that because the founders of our Constitution did not foresee the technological ability to have permanent irreparable effects on future generations. They, in their wisdom, drafted a wonderful constitution with a due process clause and equal protection came later. The founders didn't foresee that they would need to grant rights to future persons for any kind of foreseeable eventuality. And if they knew about the technologies that allow climate change, I'm sure they would have drafted the clause about not denying life, liberty, or property to any person without due process of law to include future persons to the extent we are impairing their life, liberty, or property in advance. And this whole process ignores that. So basically, we're all agreeing what will the living, poor, and rich countries agree to do that's convenient for them, but they know will still double or triple carbon dioxide and make scenarios that are going to be intolerable for people who come afterward. No scenario that ignores that reality is going to be legitimate or just in my mind, and it will only pass muster if the public continues not to hear that argument.
Well, I think that the reason that we're concerned about this issue is essentially future generations. That is, if we were only concerned about our own welfare, we'd be much less concerned about climate change. Because the adverse effects are much more likely to come out in the future, 50, 60, 70, 100 years from now. And the uncertainties are greater there, and so therefore the possibility of the very bad long-tail events is worse. The possibility is worse. So I think that's the premise. And it's a premise which is maybe not widely enough accepted. We don't have any means of actually giving voice to those future generations.
Or you have an amendment to the Constitution that creates a personhood for the class of future adults who may be impaired by the action of present adults.
But we would
have something like an appointed attorney general function pursuant to a constitutional amendment.
We would still have to represent those people. They wouldn't have direct voice. They might have rights, but they wouldn't have participation voice.
Someone whose job is to represent their interests,
so,
perhaps, just as we have guardians ad litem to represent the interests of infants.
Well, it's an interesting idea, but it's certainly the premise of this whole debate, I think, is the premise you're sharing. That is that we care about future generations, otherwise we wouldn't be so excited about climate change.
My basic point is that no scenario that contemplates tripling of CO2 beyond historic or present levels seriously takes into account the rights of future adults. If they were present and represented in the process, they'd say, no way, Jay, step back. You have a major job to do. You're cutting back more radically than you conveniently want to now.
Now the issue that raises in the policy debate is the issue of discount rates. If you follow the conventional economist way of discounting the future by 3 or 4% a year, those future generations have zero weight, essentially. Whereas a Stern report, which discounts at 0.5% a year, I think, for uncertainty, they have considerable weight, and that's where it comes through in the policy debate. But Rob wants to recognize somebody else.
Whole rationale for discounting falls apart.
Well, I'm not sure.
You cannot discount the rights of the person who's not here. You can only discount the costs or benefits that you perceive in the future for yourself as a voluntary actor. You can't impose them on someone else. Yeah. So their rights and interests are 100%.
If I could translate what you're saying, it's an exercise of power on the part of the present generation to have a discount rate.
But
and we got it.
But what you're missing there. But you're missing something there because you're talking about costs and benefits, and so it has to be contingent on our expectations about economic resources. If this were just an economic issue, and there were no chance of huge uncertainties, that we just knew that it was going to cost them something more every year because of climate change. Then if we had good reason to believe, this is the economist's argument, that they'll be much richer in the future, then there'd be little reason for people who are poor to sacrifice so they can be a little bit richer and even being much richer. So that's the economist's argument, which ignores the uncertainty part. And I think that you should clarify the argument, because if it's just a matter of cost and benefits, I don't think you're on strong ground. If it's a matter of uncertainties that could be life-threatening and society-threatening to these people, which they have no authority over, then I think there's a much stronger case.
There are three people in this. Who's got the microphone? There are three people in the middle row.
George?
Take them in one order.
Or come this way.
Order.
Right.
George Cato. Right. Greetings.
George Kateb, Department of Politics. Two definitional questions, Bob. The first is, when you speak of sociological legitimacy, are you saying that people in a society act as if there were normative legitimacy, but they might be mistaken, or they might simply be indifferent to the question? I would ask you, if I've understood you correctly, to sharpen the distinction between two kinds of legitimacy. Second question is this. You use the term minimal justice. It's a term that, when Walzer and others use it, bothers me a lot, because I think it may hide what you're really saying, which is that the system is a combination of moral and immoral elements, that the system is incompletely moral or just, and is rounded out, so to speak, by a combination of just elements and unjust elements. And to say minimal, I think, might obscure that point, if that is your point.
Okay, thanks. I do believe about sociological legitimacy that, in fact, the rough conception here is that people do have a notion of what is normatively legitimate. And if we argue about that, we're making an ethical argument. But if I ask the question, what do people believe is normally legitimate, I'm asking a factual question. And in fact, that factual question relies on these people thinking normatively. I don't think I said minimal justice. I wouldn't have said that. I think justice is an ideal standard. I said that institutions can be minimally morally acceptable. And I agree with you that, in fact, one of my sort of arguments really is that we shouldn't attempt or demand a just climate change system, because the system is going to necessarily be incompletely just. And we'll just discover that, and if we say that was our threshold, we'll say we shouldn't have the institution, but that would be self-defeating. So I think that systems are almost always a combination of just and unjust elements, and that by pushing for greater legitimacy, we can improve the balance of it. By the way, Chuck, on your point about transparency and accountability, WTO and IMF are immensely more transparent and accountable than 10 years ago. There's been an enormous difference in those, pushed by NGOs. Now, they're probably less effective than they were then. They certainly they aren't more effective, but there's no doubt they're much more transparent, look on the websites, and accountable than they were. So those things can change. In fact, the real question, I think, is whether, if they change, whether that does you any good if the institution is not accomplishing any of its purposes. Who's next?
I think it's me. So I'm wondering whether or not you would... Oh, sorry, Daryl Mullendorf is my name. I'm wondering whether or not you would want to add an additional requirement to legitimacy, namely that any agreement, any legitimate agreement would have to conform with the norms of already existing agreements.
No, I would not.
Yeah, why not, I guess is what I wonder.
Because existing agreements are themselves power-laden. They reflect a power balance of the future. So, for example, would you want to say, suppose we had a serious possibility of having a UN system with a Security Council with no veto. We wouldn't want to say, well, we can't do that because the previous agreement has a veto. The previous agreements are full of injustice, and so, in fact, we'd like to improve on them. So I certainly wouldn't say that.
So then I guess I wonder whether or not you're not going to run into the kind of worries that Chuck Beitz was raising, that it's going to begin to look pretty unrealistic. That is, if you're going to have a set of legitimacy requirements that aren't anchored in some way to already existing requirements.
Well, they're anchored
procedures.
They're anchored in a sense. There wouldn't be a principle that you shouldn't change the principle. But they're anchored in the sense that to be legitimate, in each case, they should be as good or better as existing ones. The default option is we're back where we are in the status quo. And so I think if you take this combination of items, including accountability, transparency, the kind of process ones, as well as outcomes. We ought to find that the institutions we devise or propose are superior to the current ones. So right now we have virtually 0 climate change institutions, so it's a kind of low threshold for that. If at some point in the future we then have a pretty good climate change institution, we'd have to have a higher standard, right? To be legitimate, the new institution, if I have an idea in 20 years for a new institution which is better than the X institution that exists, I've got to show that it's really going to be superior. It'll be a harder standard than now when we have nothing.
I should pass this on, but I just wanted to, just one thing. Right now we do have though a rich set of accepted international norms for climate change in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Very rich set of norms there.
Yes, a rich and very flawed set of norms, because the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is so vague. On one sense, it's meaningless. The other sense, it says that the developing countries shouldn't have to do anything. And so the first sense is meaningless, and the second sense is it's pernicious. So we have a rich set of norms. Some of them are very worthwhile, and some of them, I think, are problematic. So I think we should never equate legality with morality or what is with what we would like to be.
I'm Liz Harmon from Philosophy and Human Values, and I just had a clarificatory question, and I think that you may have just answered it, but when you were listing the 5 principles of legitimacy, the last one was comparative benefit, effectiveness, and I thought I heard you say that legitimacy required that the institution have better results than alternative feasible arrangements, meaning alternative possible arrangements, which actually seemed far too demanding for legitimacy. What you just said was it just has to be better than what came before it or what we currently have, which is much weaker. And I just wondered which you want to endorse.
Well, I said alternative feasible arrangements, not possible arrangements. I mean, I can dream up lots of arrangements that are better than what would be legitimate. That is politically feasible, politically, economically, sociologically.
That seems surprisingly strong to me, if that's what you mean.
Well, I don't think it's very strong because I think in general what we actually observe, we observe because of political constraints. So I don't think there are many institutions out there that are politically feasible that haven't been instituted.
Well, isn't that a strong claim, though, that all of our institutions are the best that were feasible?
They aren't the best, but there's not a lot of Pareto superior institutions lying around that nobody has figured out how to construct. Maybe there are a few, and I try to figure out that there are some, and so I try to work on that. But I don't think that they're lying free on the ground, because normally you'd expect that if there were institutions that everybody who's powerful enough to implement an institution would benefit from, well, then somebody would have figured it out by now.
So optimistic.
Chuck?
Not morally. It's not morally optimistic. Liz, maybe it's optimistic about the wisdom of crowds.
Yeah. Bob, this is a footnote to Liz's question, because I had exactly the same reaction that she did, and it's a small point, but what you say is that the results institutions to be legitimate must produce results that are better than those that alternative feasible institutional arrangements or their absence could create. And I think it is demanding in the sense that what it says is that an institution is legitimate only if it's the best feasible institution for its purpose. And, my guess is that most institutions that we have are not the best feasible institutions for their purpose. So and this is a necessary condition for legitimacy, so if that's what, I don't think it's what you really mean, but if that were the condition, I think we would have turned we would have had, this part of the threshold is a very high threshold.
It is what I mean, I think.
Can I try to suggest...
Suppose that you can devise an alternative feasible institution, which is better than mine by my standards. I should then agree to it. I'm happy.
But if it's the institutions don't change, and we're stuck with the one that's the number 2 on the list, according to your theory, we have to say it's not legitimate. But we don't want to say that.
There's a concept in math called the local maximum, and then there's a global maximum. So you can imagine a little hill where you're sitting on, and it's as good as you can do without going all the way over to some other hill, which is higher yet. And it might really be difficult to decide whether that was feasible or not, because path over there might be very problematic. So I think you might be struggling with the concept of local maximum between the two of you. And let me ask a question, because I am concerned that there's something about global climate change, which is, although these have been two wonderful talks, you're not really coming quite to grips with. And that is how much is being demanded of the rich by the problem as it's presented. We are not in a situation where we can sort of hold the rest of the world down, stay in our own, with our own ways, and address the problem. I mean, what is being demanded is a tremendous amount of change of everyone. And it occurs to me that one could even divide problems, global problems, into those where you could get away with the status quo or small changes from it on the one hand, and others where a great deal of change is required of everyone. The AIDS problem may have some of the elements where everybody had to do things differently, but climate change is extremely much that way. And so we wealthy will have to come up with solutions for ourselves to deal with a problem at all. And they have no reason intrinsically to be solutions that are only for us. And so there is a positive virtual circle here somewhere, where things that help one can help all. The technological end run is really part of this problem, because if we can't fix something for ourselves, the problem isn't solved. If we can fix it for ourselves, we can fix it for others. And if others who are less advantaged fix it for themselves, they could fix it for us. So there's this reciprocity embedded in the problem that I'd really be interested in having you address. It changes the problem somewhat from the way in which you're formulating it, it seems to me, where it's all, okay.
Well, I think that's certainly right, and it reminds me of a recent report I read this morning by the Pew Trust on climate change in the U.S. and China, which is mostly focused on technological solutions which both parties would gain by, such as carbon capture and storage, because China is so dependent on coal. And so from a political point of view, that's enormously helpful to think about ways in which a change that helps us will help them. It doesn't really get at the first question you raised, though, which is the question about how much is demanded of us. And that's the question I raised with demanding a lot of change from the rich and powerful who aren't used to making those changes themselves. They're used to imposing them on somebody else.
Yeah, but put numbers in. If say the world should emit totally 1/3 of what it emits right now, and we emit half and the poor emit half, we both have to come down, and you're dividing a number less than what either of us does among us both. And that's the intrinsic character of the problem.
That's right.
And that is different from an awful lot of other problems that go under the general rubric that you're...
Well, it's a very, very hard problem. I'm not terribly optimistic at all about solving this problem.
It's
because
harder than many others.
If we were any, not just, but any workable climate change institutions that would actually get us to the point where we are limiting climate change to a reasonable amount, would be the greatest cooperative enterprise in world history by an order of magnitude. So it's not very likely, probably.
And then among the solutions, we haven't mentioned one which certain people will say, well, it's just obvious. Why aren't we just going there? Is nuclear power, which is a non-fossil energy source. One could run the world on nuclear power. And its fraught dimensions in international arrangements and relations, which are holding us back from going there. And in some sense, the very first move you make toward a non-carbon economy, well, one of three options, but the one that is, in some sense, compelling on technical terms, has got the most dangerous international dimensions. And so that's another sort of feature of this problem that we could draw out, that the solutions themselves, several of the solutions, are really have the prospect of making the situation still worse.
Some other dimension.
On another dimension.
Denise had a question.
Yeah, where are we?
Denise is right there.
Where's Denise?
I'm here. I'm Denise Masrell, a professor in the STEP program. And I was interested by your requirement that a climate agreement be inclusive, because as we all, I think, here recognize, we have a dire need to address this problem one way or another. And if we maintain extremely high standards, we may, as you point out, end up being fairly pessimistic and not having a global agreement on what to do. So I'm wondering what you think of initiatives like the G8 plus 5, where we would include the G8 countries plus the 5 major developing countries in the world in an attempt to reach some form of an agreement to cap greenhouse gas emissions. Would that be consistent with your goals?
I think it's quite consistent to have a two-stage or multi-stage process. That is, you're not going to start out with 192 countries because you're not going to get anywhere in agreement. So starting with the G8 plus 5 or the G20 that was convened in Washington in November is a reasonable place to start. And they account for, the top 15 account for roughly 85% of emissions anyway. So, and this is the way actually trade agreements, when they were made, they're not made anymore, they're just vetoed, but when trade agreements were made, they were made by discussions among a small number of countries in the so-called green room, which were then brought out to the whole membership of GATT or WTO and have to be approved. Inclusiveness means that you have to give everybody some voice. So it would not, in my view, be acceptable simply to say, we're the biggest 15, here's our agreement, we're imposing it on the rest of the world. But it would be acceptable to say, we've gotten together and we have worked out this agreement which is satisfactory to us. Let's get your comments and suggestions on it, and we're open to your ideas, but we're not going to give you a veto if you're Mali.
So would there be any parallels then between an approach like you're describing and what the Montreal Protocol did, where they had trade sanctions against non-complying countries? That was actually a fairly coercive mechanism that was highly effective and clearly to the global benefit of everyone, though perhaps at that time might have appeared, unjust at some level to those countries who had no choice but to ratify the protocol, because otherwise they'd be excluded from trade in compounds which in material that included ozone-depleting substances.
I think that when I talked about that is coercive, certainly. If say,
but for the global benefit.
Yes, but if say 150 countries say we need a climate change agreement, and there are 15 outliers or free riders who aren't agreeing, and we then say we're going to impose trade sanctions on you if you produce anything without these rules, that's coercive. But I didn't say that coercion was always bad. I said it was the most difficult to justify. I think in this case, the justification would be that it's a global good, that there's a free rider incentive, that these countries have no valid reason not to accept the agreement, if it's a generally reasonably legitimate agreement, and they are just trying to exploit the others by not paying for it, and therefore they are justly sanctioned. That would convince me that would be a reasonable argument.
How many hands are there left? Okay, there. And that may be the last question.
Helen Hunt from the Princeton community. Could you please elaborate on what you have in mind for accountability and transparency? Those are wonderful terms, but there could conceivably be some loose space there for some cheating, for some things that are not reported or misrepresented in the information that's given. And I wondered what you have in mind for effective transparency and accountability in order for it to provide the benefit that you're looking for.
Well, as Chuck Beitz pointed out, these will not be perfectly met any more than justice, right? So we're not going to have a perfectly transparent system or a perfectly accountable system. And as my quotation from the report on China indicated, the Chinese don't have an accountable system. The Chinese leadership can't even tell what the localities are doing much of the time. So we're working toward more accountability and more transparency. We're not going to be talking about some perfection. Accountability has, in my view, three components. There have to be a set of standards that are clear. There has to be information available, that's the transparency part, to the wider public about the performance of the rulers meeting those standards. And there has to be some sanction for non-conformity. That is, if the public has no ability to discipline the rulers, it doesn't amount to accountability. So we should ask about any set of climate change institutions do they have some provisions for accountability, and are those as strong as we can reasonably make them in view of political objections by others and also in view of maybe questions about effectiveness, because you don't want, if you have too many auditors running around, maybe no one knows anything. And transparency is then really a component of accountability, in my view. And Chuck's quite right. This is a process standard for legitimacy. It's never going to be always fully met, although I think that by pressing for it, as has been the case with WTO and IMF, you can get higher standards of performance.
Okay, let's thank the speakers. Thank you all for coming.